September has been a pretty good month for me financially because this is the month that I actually get dividends from both Microsoft and Google. Now, for Costco, my third stock, Costco does pay dividends, but it's going to pay me dividends on November because it paid me last month in August. It pays me every 3 months. Now, you might be wondering, why are Google and Microsoft paying you, Andy? Like, what are dividends? The best analogy I can give you to describe dividends is the idea of being a farmer, right? Imagine you're planting trees and you work so hard to plant those trees. And then after some time, those trees give you fruits that you can sell, that you can eat, that you can consume, whatever you want to do with the fruits, they're yours to choose, right? It's yours. That's the same thing with dividends. The trees are your companies. You're working so hard to build them up. You're working so hard on your 9 to 5 to make sure that you have as much trees as possible. And then what happens is that these companies, just like the trees, they start giving you fruits. They start giving you dividends. Dividends are essentially excess earnings that the company has made that they don't really need, so they give it on and pass it along to the shareholders like you and me. And as you can see on the photos, that's why I have so much dividends coming in on September. Now, the good thing about dividends, what I typically do with my dividends is that I put these dividends right back into the same companies. What that does is that the next following 3 months, I'm gonna be getting more dividends and more dividends. It's essentially a snowballing effect. If I were to give you the same analogy with the trees, instead of eating the fruit, instead of selling the fruit, what I end up doing is I use those fruits to buy more fruit tree seeds. And I get those seeds, I plant more seeds. So then the next quarter, I get even more seeds. And as you can see, it starts becoming as like a snowball pattern where every quarter over quarter, you get more dividends and more dividends. And that's essentially the plan. That's how most wealthy people live their lives because they're buying into assets that are appreciating or cash flowing. Hopefully, you can do both. But in this particular case with dividends, it is a cash flow mechanism. Now, you might be very curious on why don't these companies just hold on to the money itself? Why don't Google, Microsoft, Costco, why don't they just hold the money themselves so that they don't have to give it to somebody else? Why would they just give away their money? The main reason is because if the company knows they're not going to utilize those money for anything useful, like there's no additional growth needs that they have right now, they pass along those money to shareholders like you and me. And in those cases, they pass along the taxes to me and you. What happens is that when they give us dividends, that money that they gave away, the companies, the corporations don't have to pay taxes on those. However, me and you will have to pay taxes on those. Now, the good thing is, even though we pay taxes, it is still worth more than if we didn't have anything. I'd rather at least get $50, $80 of Microsoft shares of dividends, my apologies, rather than literally get nothing in return. Now, dividends are special because they're one of the very few assets that's really easy to get into. Like another cash flow type of asset is real estate. However, with real estate, even though you're collecting rent payments, it's really hard to get started with real estate. You have to have a lot of money to get started with. You can't just start with $10. The nice thing about dividends, you can literally start as small as possible. That's the very nice thing. You can start with very little capital and it doesn't take a lot to get started. You just open a brokerage account, pick the companies that do pay a dividend and go from there. Now, do every corporation pay dividends? Absolutely not. There's a lot that do pay dividends, but there are a lot that does not pay dividends. Now, where does that say? All the companies will disclose that in their financial sheets before you actually buy them. You'll be able to see that when you're in your Robinhood, Vanguard, Fidelity. There's a portion where it tells you how much they give in dividends. And each corporation gives different types of dividends. For example, Google pays a less dividend than Microsoft, and Costco has even different type of dividends where they give special dividends where because certain quarters they make so much money that they don't know what to do with, they give out more and more money to shareholders like you and me. Now, this idea of getting dividends and buying more of the same stocks with those dividends is what we call compounding effect, where you just let your investments compound over time. You have your trees, they produce more fruits, you get those fruits, you buy more fruit trees, and then you have a forest, a rainforest of trees that just keep giving you fruits quarter over quarter, and it compounds over time, just like how a snowball does, just like how a fruit tree does. And another fun fact about dividends is that you do also want to diversify. You don't want to put all your fruits, all your dividends into one single stock, right? Imagine just like a fruit tree, you don't want to have just oranges. You want to have different types of fruit trees. You want to have apple trees, you want to have cherries, you want to have different types of fruits so that if there's some sort of sickness with one of the trees, you have other trees you can depend on. Now you might be thinking, Andy, if we can just compound this all the time, why don't we just buy all the dividend stocks? We should only buy dividend stocks. Well, not exactly. There are certain dividend companies, or what we call a dividend trap. So, what a dividend trap is a corporation or a company that is struggling to make money, that is just struggling real hard to stay alive. And what they do is because they know that there are certain investors that just look for the dividend rates. They are a company that increase their dividend rate to a high amount so that investors buy into them. However, because their business model is flawed, because their business model is not able to grow its cash flows, its revenues over time, what they end up doing is that the value of the stock starts dropping more than the dividends that they give out. So as a result, it's like a trap. The company lures customers in or investors with the lower yield. However, once they get into the stock, the overall stock yield falls because the stock price is falling. Now, when the stock price keeps on falling, the corporation could either do two things. They can go ahead and increase the yields, or they could actually cut the dividend yield, which further lowering the stock price, and as a result can be very harmful to dividend investors. And so you should always be very mindful of those dividend traps and be careful on why a certain company has a super high dividend yield. And that's why I don't always chase the high dividend yields, because as you can know, companies like Costco, companies like Microsoft, companies like Google, especially. Google doesn't have a very high dividend yield. It's because I'm not only investing just because they have a dividend yield. Now, the opposite of dividend traps are companies what we consider dividend kings. Like, for example, Johnson and Johnson is what we consider a dividend king, because this is a stock that doesn't matter what economic cycle we're going through, they always pay out their dividends, and they actually increase their dividends over time. Whereas certain companies, they can keep their dividends the same or they could lower it, but certain companies, they increase it over time. And something important about dividends to know is that you want to understand how the company is paying you dividends. Like, if the company is paying the shareholders dividends because they're actually increasing their cash flows, increasing their revenues from selling their products or services, that's a great move. That means the company is growing. However, if the company is borrowing money to pay the shareholders the dividends, now that's an awful sign. That means that there could be some trouble with the company, because at one point the banks will no longer lend to them. And at one point, the company has to pay back the borrowed money that they received. Now, a couple things to really keep in mind about dividends is that because dividends are really good fixed income, like they give out cash on a quarterly basis, this is an amazing tool that a lot of seniors use that are retired. Because people that are retired, they want a constant flow of cash flow. And the way that a lot of the customers I see handle with dividends is they essentially buy into dividend stocks and use those dividends as their daily life supplement, as their daily expenses. And it's an amazing way for them to still keep their principal stock value intact while just living off the dividends itself. And it's an amazing idea. And that's how a lot of people I see become financially free, because they don't have to work for money anymore. They just have to collect the rents or collect the dividends from these companies that are paying them dividends. Now, one thing to very, very importantly keep in mind is that just because a company pays dividend doesn't mean it's the best company. And just because a company doesn't pay dividends doesn't mean it's an awful company. Sometimes when a company doesn't pay dividends, it's because they're investing that money within the business itself. For example, for the longest time, Facebook Meta was a company that didn't pay dividends because they were putting that money to keep on growing the business. And sometimes when a company gets too mature and they don't have any good growth aspects, that's when they start to pay dividends. And that's when people actually start getting a little bit worried, because when you're a growth company and then you suddenly become a dividend company, people, investors start asking themselves, what happened with the stock? Is the stock stopped growing? Is there nothing else that the company can buy into to grow its business? That's why there's a pro and a con to giving dividends. A good part I like, good type of company that I like, are companies that are able to grow their dividend, yet also is a growth stock where they're not paying so much dividends that's gonna hamper the company, but they are still using some of those money to grow the company and some of the money to give out to shareholders. A good example of this is a company like Amazon, where Amazon is using all of their cash to grow into their business. They keep on developing their business lines, keep on developing their operational tasks so that they can become a more efficient company. Now, the moment Amazon may start paying dividends, some some investors could be worried, like, oh, why is Amazon suddenly giving out dividends? Is Amazon stopped growing? Has Amazon thought of nothing else to use that money on? It's kind of like a double-edged sword. Obviously, we love companies that pay dividends, but when a company doesn't pay dividends and it suddenly starts paying dividends, instead of being seen as an amazing thing, there are a lot of skepticism within that stock. That is something you do want to be watching out for. And you want companies that are growing their dividends over time. Like, what do I mean by growing dividends? Is like a company that is able to just increase its dividend yield. Let's say, for example, they were giving out 1% yields on their dividends. The next year, they could be giving out 1.1% dividend yield. And then the next year following that, an increase. You get the perspective there. Now, what is my personal thought process on dividends? I don't specifically invest just because a company has dividends. I'm totally fine investing in a company that doesn't pay dividends as long as they're doing something to increase shareholder value, such as stock buybacks. They can buy back their stocks. And if you buy back your own stocks, there are less shares of that stock available, hence lower supply, increasing the price of that stock. Or they could be doing like what Amazon is doing, where they're just building their business line. They're becoming a more efficient company. They're becoming a more operational found company. I am totally okay with that as well. Currently, I do invest in just three stocks: Costco, Microsoft, Google. They all pay dividends, however, at all very drastically different dividend rates. Like, for example, Costco is known notoriously for paying dividends and also giving out special dividends, where they could actually give you at random a higher dividend just because they had an amazing quarter, just because they had a quarter where they made so much sales that they don't know what to do with the money, so they're gonna give it to shareholders like me and you. I'm always happy with that. The second one is Microsoft stock. And Microsoft is in the middle between Costco and Google, where they are still giving out dividends. However, they are doing it at a very modest rate. It's a very reasonable rate. It's not too much and it's not too low of a dividend yield. And then my third company, Google. Google is one of those companies that just recently started paying dividends. And as a result, they started out very small. They don't pay too much of a dividend. The last time I checked, I believe it's about 0.12% dividend yield. And that's totally fine with me. I don't need Google to be a dividend paying company because they are still using that money to grow their business line, to grow and become a better company, where they're using that money to increase its AI capabilities, to increase its cloud capabilities. I am totally okay with that. And that's what I think about dividend stocks.